So those are the kind of range of questions around the beginning of life, around conception and assisted conception. I should also step back just for a moment and say that, again, if we sort of take the Roman Catholic position as one touchstone of range of views on these questions, just as they would view artificial contraception as officially prohibited, they would also view the use of most of these assisted conception techniques as inappropriate, where they result in the possibility of the destruction of a fetus. So those are questionable and practices from a theological, ethical perspective that we need to think through and kind of talk through when we develop our own thoughts about them. So this brings us to the question of abortion. And of course, this is one of the major social issues of our time, from the United States Supreme Court Roe versus Wade decision, which we will talk more about next week. On the one hand, there are those who view this as a fundamentally important constitutional right and something that is absolutely necessary for women if they're going to really be functionally equal to men in our society. And of course, on the other hand, there are those who view abortion as the termination of a human life and as either never justifiable or only extremely rarely justifiable, and who view Roe v. Wade and the constitutional right to abortion as one of the sort of great legal issues and difficulties of our time. Obviously a hugely divisive issue. So before we begin to talk about some of the theological and ethical issues around this question of abortion, I do think it's important that we have a good scientific basis for understanding the underlying issues. And because these technological, theological issues are issues that relate to scientific questions. And I think it's important for us to understand how the process of conception and the development of a baby and the birth of a baby works. Now, I think probably many of us have some sense of this from other things we've learned or seen, but I want to take a few minutes. It's about 10 minutes long, and I'm going to show you a video clip from a TED Talk about so it's a computerized scientific visualization of conception through birth. And so I'm going to pause here for a moment. I'm going to show you this video, and then we'll come back.
I was offered a position as Associate Professor of Medicine and Chief of Scientific Visualization at Yale University in the Department of Medicine. And my job was to write many of the algorithms and code for NASA to do virtual surgery in preparation for the astronauts going into deep space flight so they could be cut in robotic pods. One of the fascinating things about what we were actually working on is that we were seeing, using the new kind of scanning technologies, things that had never been seen before. I mean, not only in disease management, but also things that allowed us to see things about the body that just made you marvel. I remember one of the first times we were looking at collagen, and your entire body, everything, your hair, skin, bone, nails, everything is made of collagen. And it's a kind of a rope-like structure that twirls and swirls like this. And the only place that collagen changes its structure is in the corner of your eye. In your eye, it becomes a grid formation, and therefore it becomes transparent as opposed to opaque. So perfectly organized a structure, it was hard not to attribute divinity to it, because we kept on seeing this over and over and over again in different parts of the body. One of the opportunities I had was one person was working on a really interesting kind of micromagnetic resonance imaging machine with the NIH, and what we were going to do is scan a new project on the development of the fetus from conception to birth using these kinds of new technologies. So I wrote the algorithms and code, and he built the hardware. Paul Lauterborough then went on to win the Nobel Prize for inventing the MRI. I get the data, and I'm going to show you a sample of that piece from conception to birth. Thank you. But as you can see, when you actually start working on this data, it's pretty spectacular. And as we kept on scanning more and more, working on this project, looking at these two simple cells that had this kind of unbelievable machinery that will become the magic of you. And as we kept on working on this data, looking at small clusters of the body, these little, pieces of tissue that were the trophoblast coming off of the blastocyst, all of a sudden burrowing itself into the side of the uterus, saying, I'm here to stay. All of a sudden having a conversation of communications and the estrogens, the progesterones, saying, I'm here to stay, plant me, building this incredible trilinear fetus that becomes within 44 days something that you can recognize, and then at 9 weeks is really like a kind of a little human being. The marvel of this information, how do we actually have this biological mechanism inside our body to actually see this information? I'm going to show you something pretty unique. Here's a human heart at 25. It's just basically 2 strands. And like this magnificent origami, cells are developing at 1 million cells per second at 4 weeks as it's just folding on itself. Within 5 weeks, you can start to see the early atrium and the early ventricles. 6 weeks, these folds are now beginning with a papilla in the inside of the heart, actually being able to pull down each one of those valves in your heart until you get actually a mature heart, and then basically the development of the entire human body. The magic of the mechanisms inside each genetic structure saying exactly where that nerve cell should go. The complexity of these, the mathematical models on how these things are indeed done are beyond human comprehension. Even though I am a mathematician, I look at this with a marvel of how do these instruction sets not make these mistakes as they build what is us. It's a mystery, it's magic, it's divinity. I mean, then when you start to take a look at an adult life, take a look at this little tuft of capillaries. It's just a tiny substructure, microscopic, but basically by the time you're at 9 months and you've given birth, you have almost 60,000 miles of vessels inside your body. I mean, and only 1 mile is visible, 59,999 miles that are basically bringing nutrients and taking waste away. The complexity of building that within a single system is, again, beyond any comprehension of any existing mathematics today. And then instruction set from the brain to every other part of the body. Look at the complexity of the folding. Where is this intelligence of knowing that a fold can actually hold more information? So as you actually watch the baby's brain grow, and this is one of the things that we're doing right now. We're actually doing a longitudinal studies of actually scanning babies' brains from the moment they're born every 6 months until they're 6 years old. We're going to be doing actually about 250 children, watching exactly how the jidai and the sukai of the brains fold to see how this magnificent development actually turns into memories and the marvel that is us. And it's not just our own existence, but how does the woman's body understand to have genetic structure that not only builds her own, but then has the understanding that allows her to become a walking immunological cardiovascular system that basically is a mobile system that can actually nurture, treat this child with the kind of marvel that, is beyond, again, our comprehension, the magic that is existence, that is us. Thank you.
Now, I was present for the birth of each of my 3 children, all of whom are young adults or teenagers now. And I was astonished by the process then and deeply respected my wife for it. And after watching these visualizations, I think even more so, you have the respect for anyone who goes through the process of bringing a baby to term and giving birth. Quite an extraordinary thing. But some of the things that, on the scientific side that I wanted you to see there is some things that really aren't in dispute. So some things that aren't in dispute, at those very, very earliest stages, you can see in the visualization, what looks very much like a group of cells that are beginning to grow and beginning to divide. And we have data about kind of how often sort of spontaneously those very early blastocysts are not successfully implanted in the uterus and don't successfully come to term. There are many very, very early stage pregnancies where the woman might not even really realize that there had been a fertilized egg. So that does happen fairly often naturally. And we see at those very, very early stages, it doesn't look like a whole lot, but of course all the genetic material is already there. We're going to be talking about genetic issues in just a little bit. But then also we see how pretty rapidly the beginnings of the human body begin to develop, how the beginnings of the heart begin to develop, and the brain and all these other aspects of the human body begin to develop. And then, certainly within the first trimester and into the second trimester, how the baby is beginning to form in the mother's body. So important and useful for us to have an understanding of that development and how marvelous it is when it's happening inside the woman who's carrying that baby, and that this is, what's at stake when we're talking about abortion. Is this developing human creature? Now, when we talk about that, I have a list of issues kind of on the screen, and we can talk some more about these in class. One approach to think about this is the question of personhood. Is this a human person, or when is this a human person? And if it's a human person, most people would agree that there's some rights, some entitlements, some respect that it's due. It's due, more rights and entitlement and respect, most people would agree, than, an insect or a chicken or even a dog, right? But when is it a human person entitled to those rights? That's one way to approach it, and it's a way that, particularly in some deontological threads of trying to think through questions about abortion, many people have thought about it. Related to that is this question of the soul. One of the classical ways of thinking about it, and again, I think sometimes in the Catholic tradition often emphasized that human beings are a combination of body and soul, and that at the very moment of conception, the view is the Catholic view is God provides a soul with that body, and so that the destruction of that body is a sort of unnatural disjoining of that body and that soul, and further suggests that it's the killing of a human person. So question is, what is the soul? Do we want to say that we have souls, or that souls are part of us? If souls are part of the human constitution, in what way are they part of the human constitution, and when do they become part of the human constitution? Do we want to think about this concept of sort of this developing newly fertilized egg and God sort of giving it a soul? Is that and I don't think that's exactly how most Catholic theologians would think about it, but you can almost visualize the language that way. How would you think about it? Is the soul an emergent property that comes as the brain develops? Is it really inappropriate in the scientific age to speak of the soul as a kind of substance or thing? These are big issues. They're debated in theology, and they do relate in some ways to our ethical perspectives on abortion. Now, this question of personhood isn't necessarily the only way to think through all these issues about abortion. And in fact, I think many theological ethicists would say it can be really kind of problematic to think this way, because if we're defining, what is a human person and what isn't, we're going to have to make some really difficult choices. And how are we going to make those choices? Are we going to reduce it all the way down to something really essentialist, like it has human DNA, it has fully, put together human DNA. All of the genetic information is there, even at that moment of fertilization, even before the the zygote is implanted in the uterus and begins to grow and develop, all that genetic information is there. Does that make it a human person? Does that have the key ethical significance? Now, I can just go like this and wipe off a bunch of skin cells, and each one of those skin cells has my full complement of human DNA. But I don't think anyone would argue that those skin cells that I've just wiped off are human persons. They're dead skin cells. So it can't be that just the complement of DNA is enough. Is it the complement of DNA plus the potential to develop into something? And there is in many ethical thought about abortion and human life and euthanasia, the question of a potentiality principle. So is there something vital and potential that gives the sort of continued possibility of some kind of growth, of some kind of relationality? Is that the key thing to think about? You know, all of these are questions we have to explore and talk through. We also do want to ask questions about the mother and about the father. It is, you know, too easy, probably, even if we're going to end up taking a position that says that in all cases or almost all cases, you know, abortion should be thought of as outside the bounds of Christian theological ethics. But there are real effects on the woman who has to carry a baby to term. And in particular, there are real effects on women who are poor, or on women who would end up being single mothers, or on women who were abused. There are, you know, some good arguments that a woman who was assaulted or raped, you know, maybe there are different ethical concerns that have to be in some way brought into account there. These are difficult issues, and we have to address them. The question of the father. What, if anything, are the rights of the father? Can the father, even if abortion is legal, can the father, you know, contradict the woman's will on this point? What is the role of the father? What about the problem of communities where fathers are often absent, where there's a lot of pregnancy that happens outside of marriage and the father is absent? All these kinds of questions are part of the big social complex that we need to think about when we're trying to think through our views about abortion, in particular our views about how we relate to our culture and to our laws and the like when we think about this concept. And of course, I have listed here last, but it's not, of course, the last thing in our reasoning is the question of Scripture. Now we have, you know, the famous text that probably most of you know, which is Psalm 139, and I'm gonna look at it right here. And you know, it's a beautiful psalm that talks about God's intimate knowledge of each one of us. And in the middle of the psalm, in verse 14, I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place, when I was woven together in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. And you know, this is one of the classic texts that we must talk about when we consider this issue of abortion. So let's talk about it some more in class when we meet. I mean, on the one hand, of course, this is a really strong affirmation that God is deeply concerned with the formation of each individual human person from the very beginning. And that language is really evocative. You knit me together in the secret place, and it talks about the depths of the earth. So it really pictures the womb, right, as kind of the very depths of the earth, the very depths of creation. There's sort of resonances here with some other places in the Psalms and other places in Scripture that talk about, you know, God weaving the earth together. from the very depths of the earth, from the very deeps of the earth. So there is that very strong sense that from the very beginning, God is concerned with us. On the other hand, of course, this is not a scientific text. It doesn't presuppose any knowledge of embryology or anything like that. They, of course, at the time certainly had some knowledge that there's a baby developing and would have seen instances of miscarriages and other things. So they would have had some more sophisticated knowledge than we might think. But it's not a scientific text. It doesn't make any explicit statement about when life begins, so to speak. It doesn't talk about abortion at all directly, of course. We would draw out that implication by an inference from the rest of the text. And it also really, as we look at it, is about God's providence. The days were all of my days were written in your book. That's a really interesting text in its own right when we think about providence and human freedom and God's foreknowledge and all kinds of other sorts of issues that we might raise with a text like that. All of this to point out, this is not a proof text about abortion. It doesn't deal directly with abortion, but it most certainly is, I believe, very much relevant to the discussion and a very, very strong affirmation of God's concern for the human person from the very beginning, and even from the very beginning right through to the very end. So we'll need to talk about that a little bit more also when we come together in class.